Hi, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar called MindMatters. My name is 𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗚 and I'm your host for tonight. Very excited to be bringing back yet another series of MindMatters. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the trap of trauma. I'm going to share with you a little bit about who we are and why we are doing this. This is really our give back to the community called MindMatters series. And it's organized by Breakthrough Academy and Therapy, which is a subsidiary of Architects of Life, a social enterprise that supports beneficiaries from disadvantaged background. And our focus really is to look at training, equipping, counseling, and therapeutic treatment. So all of you will be hearing from us, and when you do hear from us, it's really to share with you all this value-added knowledge and information. Very, very excited to share with you tonight's esteemed, established, and very experienced speakers, none other than Glenn, Tony, and Ong Chooi Seng. So before we start, just a disclaimer that tonight's webinar is educational in nature. It's solely from the speaker's perspective and opinion. So it should not be relied upon for any prescription or treatment of any sort. And right now, we are going to start with our first speaker, none other than Mr. Glenn Lim. So Glenn is a breakthrough specialist and coach. He's also the co-founder of Breakthrough Academy and Therapy.
Now, my first part will be the genesis of trauma. That will be my topic. And later on, Tony will anchor the impact of trauma. And lastly, Mr. Ong Chooi Seng will round it off with the remedies for trauma. Okay, so this will be the start of it all, the genesis of trauma. I mean, where did trauma come from? How does one catch or get trauma? So first and foremost, I like to just give an outlay on the onset. What is trauma? Now, according to the literature, trauma really, if you want to bring it down succinctly to a statement or to a sentence, is an emotional response to a distressing event. It is an emotional response to a distressing event, which has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, emotional, physical, social well-being. So it's not just an emotional response, but it has long-lasting adverse impact. And that's why it can be quite debilitating. And that's why it impairs our mental, sometimes even physical, because trauma affects us psychosomatically as well. We can't sleep, we've got digestive or even diet problems, and sometimes even chronic physical ailments. Now, many of us have probably read or watched the very seminal movie premiere by Dr. 𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗚, and this was released, The Wisdom of Trauma, about 2 years ago. It received worldwide acclaim. And Dr. 𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗚, who's at the forefront in terms of his subject expertise in trauma work, trauma-informed work, has this to describe trauma. He says trauma is not what happens to you, but rather it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So it's really not about the event. Sure, it could be a terrible, distressing event, maybe an accident that might have happened or an abuse on you, but it's really not about the external factors. It's really how you process and make meaning out of it. So that is the real genesis of trauma. Now, I would like to just quickly go on to talk about the different types of trauma, and I'll keep it as layman as possible. By the way, this is a public webinar, as 𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗚 rightly mentioned earlier on. So this is in no way is this a lecture or a academic discourse. It is really just general knowledge for the public. But towards the end of this seminar, this webinar, we do have an invitation for those of you who either want to partner us or who may need help, some form of help or consultation, and we want to offer that to you as our public service to all of us. So Here, we want to keep it as simple and as streetwise as possible. Here are the various types of trauma, and I'll try to explain them one by one. Now, the most common type of trauma is the acute stress trauma. Some people call it the ASD. So this is when a particular event happened that is terrible, that's distressing, disturbing, like a car crash, a death of a friend or a loved one, or some kind of abuse that you receive as a one-time event. So that would be called an acute trauma. And, terms like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, could also be part of this acute trauma. The difference between ASD, acute stress disorder, and PTSD is that PTSD has really long-lasting, prolonged effects, like years after you have frequent flashbacks, triggers, etc. It doesn't mean that acute trauma does not have. It means that for the acute, that one-time event, you almost show or manifest immediate symptoms of traumatic injury. Yeah. Next, we have chronic trauma. Now, this is slightly different. Chronic trauma means over a period of time. Chronic, prolonged exposure to trauma. This could come in the form of like bullying, especially for young people. It isn't just once or twice as an incident. It's over a period of time. And it could be even multiple as well. Abuse, whether it's verbal abuse in a dysfunctional environment, in a home setting, or sexual abuse, physical abuse. So these could spell out chronic trauma, and we treat chronic trauma slightly differently as well. But it's over a period of time where the victim, the client, would experience this intensity of the trauma slowly just escalating over time. And then number 3, complex trauma is when a victim is exposed to a variety or multiple, and it could also be chronic over time, various types of trauma experiences. This could be a child growing up in a family where not only he gets immediate familial trauma or abuse at home, but outside, maybe in school, he gets bullied as well. So that is an added layer of trauma. And then maybe something happened as he was growing up, transiting his, one of those transitional developmental transitions in his life. Maybe he had some relational issues, and maybe a girlfriend broke up with him. So all these added together becomes complicated and complex. Number 4 is what we call secondary trauma. Some people call this vicarious trauma, meaning you don't have the direct impact or the experience of a traumatic event, but you were exposed to it, like secondary smoker, right? You're not smoking, but you keep breathing in the fumes of the cigarettes of your family member, for example, every day. So secondary trauma could affect people, especially those in the line of certain healthcare professions, like caregiving at home with demented parents. And then day in, day out, you're exposed to bouts of stress or meltdowns, even parents with special needs kids, or teachers, educators who need to deal with groups of students who are either problematic behaviorally or have special requirements, special needs as well. So day in, day out, they will be affected as well, but as a secondary recipient of that trauma. Some professions like police, prisons, and firefighters, till today, even those firefighters, and I'm not talking about 9/11 back in those days, but just over time, when they keep seeing affected victims of calamities, crises, they themselves are recipients of this secondary trauma. And then lastly, I want to talk about developmental trauma. As the name suggests, it is over a period of time during your developmental years. Well, we're talking about childhood and even teenagehood. And down here I say example, ACEs, ACE, which is adverse childhood experiences. So it could be a child that grew up in a home that over a period of time, so it can be quite chronic, exposed to abuse or neglect. So it's not just being a recipient of attention, negative attention. It could be a recipient of no attention, which is neglect, emotional neglect, for example. Or he will be exposed to violence of a dysfunctional family. Maybe his parents or his mother is abused. So over a period of time, during his developmental years, he would develop developmental trauma. At this point in time, I just want to kind of cross over to ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience. I think this will be a good benchmark of understanding whether you yourself has been exposed to traumatic incidences, and it is also a good predictor to see whether in adulthood how it plays out, how it still manifests. Yeah. So ACE was first developed during studies in the mid-90s in California, and what happened was that they were studying adult behavior and adult health, well-being, and the relationship, the close relationship that had with their early childhood developmental years, especially those who had adverse experiences during childhood. And what they discovered and later on chronicled was a taxonomy of 10 ACEs of trauma, childhood trauma. And they divided it into 3 clusters like this: abuse, which include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse; neglect, which is physical neglect or emotional neglect; and household exposure to dysfunction. So together, this became the 10 classical points or yardsticks to understand childhood adverse experiences. You just type in the Google and you can actually find many assessments, brief assessments that you can take online to find out if you had been exposed. And the key to ACEs is understanding its correlation to adult behavior and a negative well-being, even your physical or medical, mental health, right? So they found a very close relationship to, for example, those who are exposed to ACEs, to lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work. It affects every part of their lives, relationships. And what was very startling was the way these adults grew to have higher incidences or occurrences of severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, even stroke, heart attacks, and all sorts of diseases, chronic diseases, right? So they started to study a little bit more on this, and over the years, they kind of refined its reports and surveys. And they realized all across the world that there are 13% of the population, okay, have 4 or more ACEs. So this 4 or more affects like 1 in 8 individuals globally. And this is a very significant number. So out of all the 10, if you have 1, 2, 3, most people have them. But once you touch the number 4 or more. So this is where the 4 or more was coined. And the impact on those with 4 or more ACEs is that you're 3 times more likely to have lung disease and adult smoking, 14 times the number of suicide attempts, right? 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, and so on and so forth. So you are predisposed in a very unhealthy, unconstructive way to all these either vices, physical disabilities, debilitations, mental health well-being, right? I would like to contextualize this. Most of you know that we are screening and broadcasting this webinar from Singapore in Asia. So I do need to do some service for our locals here. This is a study conducted last year or last 2 years on the most prevalent ACEs in Singapore. Those of you who know Singapore, we are one of the top few most affluent countries in the world, high GDP growth, and mental well-being scores are always on a high. But take a look here, guys, those of you from Singapore, right? The most prevalent ACEs in Singapore are, number 1, 46% will be emotional neglect. So parenting, family, right? We would have had this exposure of neglect. Yeah, and again, this is not hitting out against parents or parenting in Singapore, but because we're so busy, right? And sometimes we kind of abdicate that responsibility of parenting to our domestic helpers, for example. We are so busy providing financially, maybe physical needs, but not emotional needs. And then, of course, the exposure to parental separation, divorce, or death, that accounts for 21%. And then a battered mother or female guardian, emotional abuse, and so on and so forth. But the highest is emotional neglect. So even in an affluent country like Singapore, with relatively low poverty levels, just this emotional, psychological need that is not met can have adverse childhood effects as well. Now, I'd like to talk about the layman, the person who maybe did not grow up in a totally dysfunctional family. By the way, the 4 or more, for those of us who are familiar with our prison system, or I co-run a non-profit work that reaches out to ex-offenders as well as youth at risk in juvenile institutions. And we realize through the studies, anecdotally as well as empirical data, that a lot of them are in the category of 4 or more. 4 or more. But how about the layman who grew up pretty, normal, right? So here's a study that says that nearly 70%, I think it's about 68% of the population have at least one ACE. Okay, one. And I just want you to understand that even with one ACE, one exposure to an adverse childhood experience will have impact already in adult life. And here they are. So you could have mild disrupted neurodevelopment, so your brain biochemistry somehow is impaired, adoption of health risk behaviors, increased susceptibility to diseases, disability, even early death, social emotional cognitive impairment, dysfunctional interpersonal relationships, and dissatisfactory career performance or progress, prone to personal, family, or work problems. Sometimes we call this drama, right? The clients that I work with, there was this client that I saw right this morning, and she's like, okay, one day is the father or the mother or someone in the family, another day it would be the boss or the colleagues, and there seems to be always drama, negative drama that is at work in her life. Yeah, and then poor overall outlook, meaning, and purpose of life. You can't seem to set directions or goals in your life. You don't know what's next. No sense of direction and purpose. So in a way, you're not living an optimal life. And this is just, mind you, those of us who have at least one ACE. So my encouragement to us, if you are not, or if tonight is the first time you're hearing about ACEs, you can go on to Google, type in ACE assessment, brief assessment, and you'll be introduced to quite a few websites that has this tool that you can take within a few minutes just to discover how many ACEs you have had in your past. And it's just a number or a score that you can take. Okay, so with that concludes my first part, which is the genesis of trauma. At this point of time, I want to introduce our next speaker, Mr. 𝗧𝗢𝗡𝗚. I got to know him not too long ago during the pandemic. I realized that we had a lot in common, and he will anchor on the impact of ACEs. So Tony is a trauma and addiction psychologist specializing in PTSD and structural dissociation therapy. He's also the founder, CEO, as well as senior clinical psychologist of 180 Century, Asia's leading integrative trauma-informed rehab and retreat center.
So as Glenn has introduced me, I mainly run a rehab that specializes in treating any form of mental health as well as trauma. So we are able to work with dual diagnosis, and we see addiction as part of mental health, so which is very often present in those who have traumatic experience. So today, my presentation is going to help you understand the impact of trauma had on any individual. I'm not going to go into too technical, but I will keep it as layman as possible so that you guys understand. All right. So, okay. So there we are. All right. So before we go into understanding the impact of trauma, we need to understand the difference between trauma and difficult moment. I can have a difficult time in life. Does that mean I have trauma? No, right? So earlier, Glenn has already defined what attribute or what can it be meant to an individual as trauma. So in my brief explanation, I would say trauma is actually has a long-lasting effect on your body. Okay, traumatic memory does not easily get processed into a long-term memory. Example, like when you were bullied at school, and that event of bully or continuous bully during your school days could impact you as an adult in your development, right? Whereas a difficult moment can mean that you fear an exam, you could have a difficult emotion, but that may not be traumatized, yeah? A difficult moment does not have a long-lasting effect on your body. And that moment, it does get processed into your long-term memory. So I give an example like a child, fell down from his bike while playing with his friend, but he did not have a severe injury. So he learned from there that he has to be careful when he was on the bike. So that is the main definition, because this will play an important understanding when we progress into the understanding, all right? So the next thing we need to understand is also, how does trauma happen to us? So very often we say, I had a traumatic experience, but we need to understand, or we need to help the individual to understand, how does this trauma impact him or her, all right? So what you're looking here is the window of tolerance, okay? So over here, we call it when a traumatic event or something happened to a person, okay, it creates a form of instability, okay? So there are two zones that we look at over here. We have this on the top, it's called the hyperarousal, okay? Or we call it hyperactivity, hypervigilant, manic, anxiety, panic attack, rage. So very often you will see people, they are very anxious. You know, have you ever noticed someone would be shaking their leg non-stop? Yeah. So that is someone who is hyperactive. So we call this person could be stuck on the high, meaning he's hyper aroused or he's hyper vigilant. So whereas some people, due to the trauma, they could be stuck on the low, hypoarousal. What does that mean? Is they present with symptoms like depression, disconnection, easily fatigued, exhausted, or they feel numb all the time. They don't have emotion, right? And sometimes you have a friend, you talk to them and they are just like, they don't know what is going on, yeah? So this is what we call that the person is bumped out of the resilient zone. So the middle is where the zone that you function the best, all right? Okay. So what is resilient zone? Is the adaptability and the flexibility in the body, mind, and spirit, which help a person to achieve their highest capacity. The higher the resilience, the more it helps the individual with their sense of control and also to feel more positive, okay? So what happens when you don't have this, okay? It can lead to ruminating on certain issues. You just can't let go. You're easily stuck, victimized, overwhelmed, or you use unhealthy coping strategy. Like very often we see people with addiction, substance misuse, food disorder, or they engage in risky activity like gambling or taking part in like high risk activities. So this is what we call as people who lack of resiliency. Yeah. So window of tolerance is actually developed by Dr. Dan 𝗧𝗢𝗡𝗚. Yeah. And he found out that what we really need to understand is whether this person respond in a hypoarousal or hyperarousal, and we can help them to learn to regulate themselves. Okay. So hypoarousal, as we know, is categorized by a freeze response, a numb or dissociative feeling. So meaning that someone who's very shut down. Usually they have social isolation, difficulty concentrating, as well as they felt easily underwhelmed, means they don't respond to things, right? So what happens is it can affect your sleep, eating habit, mood, and energy level, all right? Hyperarousal. When a person is psychologically hypervigilant, it's very distressing, yeah? It makes them very panicky, and it often filled with anxiety. So it can be even like a normal situation when there's no real danger or threat. The person tend to be very vigilant or high alert, okay? Or sometimes it can present in OCD symptoms. So there are people who are very anxious and they have difficulty relaxing. So if you know someone who's in this stage, it's usually they are stuck in hyperarousal. Okay. So as we now know the window of tolerance, the challenge is really for us to stay in the middle part, okay, of that resiliency zone, okay, this part. All right. So either way, whether it's on the top or the bottom, it's not good for us. The challenge is how do we stay in this zone? And understand this zone is very important because that is where we function the best. So this zone actually can narrow or widen. When we are highly stressed, the resiliency zone tend to narrow down, and which means that we are easily bumped out of the zone. All right. So as part of the trauma recovery, you have to learn how to stay in the zone. Okay. So now we are going to talk about what trauma do to us, the brain, right? Very often we ask, how can this thing impact us? Okay. So just now earlier, Glenn was talking about disrupted neural development. So that is the part where I'm going to explain a bit more. So there are three areas of the brain we are going to focus on. We are not going to talk about the all part of the brain. It's going to take a whole subject, but we are going to talk about hippocampus, okay? So what it affects here is it affects the ability for an individual to recall some sort of memory, some form of memory, all right? Okay, so when trauma is happening, it will affect our memory and the way we understand certain things or remember, okay? So that's the hippocampus. Amygdala is where our fight, flight, or freeze system is. So when we are affected by trauma, these parts of the brain, amygdala, become hyperactive, right? What it do is it exhibit more fear to trigger or to things that happens around you. So what often it generates is negative emotion. So you see someone who's very sensitive, have a lot of negative emotion, it's probably they have an overreactive amygdala. Okay, so frontal cortex is where we regulate our emotion, our understanding. And when trauma happens, it does impact the front brain, okay, this part, as to the way we understand fear and regulate fear or other negative emotion become diminished, meaning the ability to do that has lower. Okay, so that is how trauma impacts the brain. So understanding this as a whole, you begin to see a person who's been traumatized, their functionality will lower. All right. So next, we are going to talk about trauma response. All right. Fight, flight, we often heard about it. All right. So in this slide, we have 4 response: fight, flight, freeze, and frown. Okay. So what we talk about here is when a person is in a flight mode, they tend to be hyper active. They become a workaholic, overthinking, There are anxiety, panic attack, OCD symptoms start surfacing, yeah, or they have difficulty sitting still. Interestingly, perfectionist is part of the flight system. Fight system in a person, usually they will present with anger outbursts, rage, or they are very controlling, okay? Or sometimes they can be seen as a bully, right? Or they can be even have very narcissistic behavior or explosive behavior. So this is fall under the fight response. As for freeze response, freeze means a person is stuck. They can't respond, all right? And in my work, we deal a lot with that, okay? Dissociation is part of freeze response. So they tend to be have difficulty making decision. They are stuck, okay? Or they are very isolated, or they always feel numb, no emotion, no feeling in the body. So that is a freeze response. Last one is the foul, okay? So in this stage, people tend to be very people-pleasing, yeah? They like to make everyone happy. They will go with everyone. They have no decision of their own. They lack identity, no boundary, or they tend to overwhelm quite easily. If you all know the concept of codependent, this is part of the foul response. So these are the 4 types of trauma response, which we can often see in people who have trauma, all right? So what are the signs and symptoms of trauma? So after trauma, a person may experience different symptoms, but they may not show all of them, but they will show quite a few. So understanding all these symptoms will help that individual to be more aware, or you can identify that in your loved one. So what are some of the symptoms? We have intrusive thought of that event. Let's say when I was young, I was bullied at school, so I tend to have the flashback of that memory. So intrusive thoughts, yeah? Visual image of that event, or a person can be quite disorientated. Sometimes they do not know where they are, or they can't remember what they are doing. Mood swing is quite a common thing I see in the clients that I work with. Confusion, they doesn't know what is happening, and sometimes they can be out of place, you know, a very awkward presentation, nightmare, and also quite commonly I see loss of memory or concentration. And this is often misdiagnosed in my work. I often see people with trauma coming in with diagnosis of ADHD. But after some exploration with them, we actually realize the presence of trauma. Yep. So the next thing we are going to study is the 3 types of symptoms, the behavioral, as well as the physical symptom and the psychological symptom of all this trauma. So we talk about the behavioral symptom. So a person may be avoiding activities that trigger their traumatic memory, like certain people, certain event. They like to have social isolation or withdrawal, or they tend to have lack of interest in things that they used to enjoy. Or some even present with addictions issue. So those are behavioral symptoms of trauma in the person. The next is the physical symptoms, means we can see in the body. So they are easily started, okay? They are very agey, no, they can't sit still, okay? Insomnia is quite common, okay? As I say, they get fatigued or exhausted easily. Quite common thing I see is the loss of memory. They tend to have very poor short-term memory, as what we call it. To some extent, it affects their sexual dysfunctional. They show no interest in having sex or having a normal sexual life. Yeah. Some even have chronic muscle pain, or they have pain in certain part of the body. Their eating and sleeping pattern had a big shift when trauma happened. Or sometimes they are extremely vigilant, alert. No, they are always on the lookout. So these are all the physical symptoms that we notice in my work here. Okay. Lastly is the psychological symptoms. I think if you talk to anyone with trauma, they could easily identify with that. Yeah. So one of the things that I notice is they have overwhelming fear. Okay, not just fear. A normal fear is understandable, but they have fear that really paralyze them. And they also are very detached from people or from their emotion. They tend to present a lot of dissociation, and this is quite common in the work I do. Shame is a big part of their psychological response, as well as shock, emotional shock, yeah, irritability, anger, OCD behavior. Interestingly, depression is also, and anxiety is quite commonly discovered in the clients that I work with, as well as guilt. When someone goes through trauma, they felt like they have not done enough, or sometimes their belief system is really disoriented. Yeah, it's not in the right way that it should function. And we also see a lot of panic attack, anxiety in my clients. So these are the 3 types of symptoms we commonly see in our clients. So we are entering into the 9 predominant so-called ways that trauma affect people, or people demonstrate all these behavior when they have trauma. And this is the last part, so please bear with me a bit. Yeah. So when we work with clients, we need to help them what type of traumatic behavior they have, and we need to educate them with appropriate coping skill. So these are the usually 9 types of behavior we help them to understand. First is trauma reaction. What is trauma reaction? Physiological or psychological reaction from an unresolved trauma, meaning that they are easily triggered. Okay. Trauma arousal. Okay. People with this symptom, they tend to seek or find pleasure in the presence of extreme danger, violence, risk, or shame. Like people who will take high risk, would involve in high risk activity, like addiction, drug use, or doing extreme sport. Yeah. Trauma pleasure. So it's a third type, is meaning someone who will seek pleasure, stimulation in the presence of extreme danger, violence, risk, or shame. Example would be, I work with a client that who also tend to have a very risky sexual activities or acting out. That is one of the trauma pleasure. Number 4 is trauma blocking. So what is trauma blocking? Is basically a person will put in effort to numb, block out, or overwhelm themselves with emotion that result from the trauma. So it's quite interestingly, why they do that is because they can't handle. They are afraid, or they have difficulty associate with regulating themselves. So what they do is they block out all this emotion. So someone who's very numb is one of the trauma blocking. Trauma splitting, meaning that you dissociate or splitting off experience, not connecting with your daily life. So what we see is usually in the form of dissociation. 6, trauma abstinence, meaning compulsive deprivation, which occur especially the moment of success or high stress, shame, or anxiety. What it really means here is you feel like you don't deserve the result of your effort that you put in. You felt like you don't deserve something nice. So that is trauma abstinence. Okay. Trauma shame. So it's a strong sense of unworthiness and self-hatred, yeah, which rooted from the traumatic experience. Like a person will tend to blame themselves. They will tend to say, I am the fault, I am the problem, I am not good enough. So that is what we call as a trauma shame. Trauma repetition, as the words imply, is a person that repeating behavior or seeking people or activities that recreate trauma experience. So it's quite strange. You will ask, why would someone do that? So it actually happened in the form of this way. They were reliving their traumatic experience. Lastly is trauma bond. Yeah. So this means that a dysfunctional attachment that occur in the presence of danger, shame, or exploitation, meaning that they are bonded to things or people that actually traumatize them. So knowing all these 9 patterns of behavior, we can help the clients to be more aware and able to apply the right coping skill. So I think the next speaker, he will be talk more about the strategy to do that. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Tony, for your time and for your really in-depth presentation. The next speaker is Mr. Ong Chooi Seng. He's a certified facilitator trained at Trauma Healing Institute in USA. And in 2005, after the Asian tsunami crisis, he was trained by the Israeli team, notably Dr. 𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗚 and Dr. Gillette Rice, on treating trauma and loss. This training was hosted by the Prince of Songkhla University in Phuket, Thailand. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Ong Chooi Seng.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on which part of the world you come from. It's good to see all of you and glad that you can join us this particular hour and time that we're having. Thanks, Glenn, for the wonderful introduction. That's far too much than more than I would claim. And thank you, Tony, for sharing the impact and the manifestation of what trauma is all about. Well, I'd like to kind of begin in a little bit of a lighter manner. If I were to ask any of you, have you heard, what would you, if I say the song, Every Breath That You Take, who comes into mind? Shadows in the Rain. What's on your thoughts? Anybody? Nobody? Oh, well, I'm a little bit disappointed. I'm kind of a little bit disappointed because yesterday, Singapore hosted Sting to a full-packed audience in the theater we have over here. And it was a wonderful time that we were treated by the performance of a great man who has brought so much songs and laughter to everyone. Now, the reason I talk about Sting was because one of the things that Sting had said about himself is that he says, I don't need to manufacture in my life to be creative. I have a big enough reservoir of sadness or emotional trauma to last me a long while. Wow, powerful words for a pop star, a rock star, somebody who is a CBE. Yeah, and of course, you know, when we think about Sting, that's really truly his stage name and not his real name. Well, he's none other than Gordon Matthew Thomas Sumner, and who himself, at the time of the song called Kings of Pain, which he identified as one of the struggles in his own life, and that was when the Police band was coming to the end of their partnerships together. And it's good to remember that any one of us can be affected by trauma. And in fact, it is true, isn't it? You know, trauma is a fact of life, whether it's small ways or big ways. It somehow has a kind of a lingering way to kind of affect us to the point that, you know, it might seem like a life sentence to everyone. Now, Peter Levine, who's done a lot of work in this area for a long time, says this out of the very fact that he was very concerned that in some places, the only kind of treatment was that you choose a medical approach of just basically giving drugs to help people recover from traumatic experience itself. And so he developed what he called the somatic experiencing approach that helps us to kind of work through the different strategies needed to help people get better. Well, no matter what it is, for each one of us, the trauma may not be your fault. Like this particular morning, I had a new client. His fiancée of 4 years walked out of him, and suddenly the dream of having a wedding that's going to be coming up this year is all shattered and gone. But you know, while trauma may not be your fault, but healing is your responsibility. If you want to get better, you need to kind of find ways to get the help that you need. And that's the reason why he decided to reach out and ask for help for himself. Well, the very first goal of trauma for any one of us in its recovery should and must be to improve the quality of life on a daily basis. Babe Rothschild says this as someone who is a body psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, a body psychotherapist. And her work and specialty centers very much on her book called The Body Remembers. Even when sometimes we decide to forget in our mind, we wish that, we don't want to be held ransom by the past ghosts of in the life that we have led. Somehow the body is able to retain it, and it comes in the most awkward period to remind ourselves. So it's quite important for us that the approach that I often think about is we need to find a way to empower the victims of trauma in order that they find ways to be able to cope, because even as therapists, we can never be with them all the time. And one of the approaches I use is simply this very simple chart. It's called the self-care wheel. Now, I use this very often in my dialogue with clients that I meet, irrespective of whether it's a phobia that they're having, whether it's initial stage, whether it's hypo or hyper stage in which they're in. It's just good to know, and also to be able to ascertain with them how they are coping in their own life themselves. The better the person is able to care for themselves, the nearer they will be towards the wholeness they need. Life balance is important, because the life that they live can be harsh. Work can be tough, and home can be rough. And so they need a balance in order to be able to cope. And so these are 6 areas in which it's important for us to kind of go through to find ways in which we can get better. Very often, we need to take care of our physical well-being. We need to be able to exercise, be able to walk, do the things that are important throughout the day and the week itself. But there's also one very important aspect that somehow we may have ourselves neglect, and that's the issue of sleep. It's important because somehow our body is made in such a way that we need at least about 7 hours of rest. And one of the interesting things is that our body is able to recover themselves. Around about 11 p.m. or so, our body begins to shut down. Different parts of our systems will begin to repair if it's given the opportunity to do so. So it's, and around about 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning, the body would have recovered the soreness, the body, the limbs that have been tired, the different parts of our body that requires to be replenished would have received the rest needed, and thereby be able to get us ready for the very next day in life itself. Now, we all have, in some ways, live in the world that we are called upon in the expertise we have, and we do live in the world, and we function the best we can. Now, it's also important that we take the right kind of breaks whenever it's needed, even when we are out there. One of the Asian contexts is that many people like to work very, very hard, and they quite often skip meals and no time for lunch even. And that's a very unhealthy way of trying to cope, and maybe actually an indication of the non-functionality, as well as some of the things that Tony has mentioned a little bit earlier on. And one of the struggles also that I often see in life here in Asia is that many people don't often take the annual leave that they're supposed to have. And so very often, if they don't look after themselves, they ended up burnt out. And truly, I can tell you that Tony has a great room for you, suite where you get Wi-Fi and plenty of space to be able to rest, but you don't really want to be there at the wrong time and the wrong occasion itself. The other important thing is that we need to also look after ourselves, whatever the expressions of hobbies that we like. Today, in our own Asian context, biking, reading, and so forth are all very important components. We need to have goals in life to be able to help sustain and continue to help develop our thinking and the way that we are to function too. So, so having goals in life is useful, but it's also important that we are not alone, and we don't need to, especially if we are not coping well in life. We need to build good friendships, and friendships allow us to foster partnerships, helps us with like-minded people to be able to encourage, help one another, and thereby be able to minimize the stress and the trauma that we may be facing ourselves. And now and then, I would also say that there's also a spiritual component that we mustn't forget. Does not matter whether you're atheist or agnostics itself. And if you have been traumatized in your life, maybe one of the things that you need to call out to is to say that, hey, whoever you are out there, I'm real down in the dumps. Help me. And you might find that you will have interesting answers to your life that you've never been thinking about. So it's important that we are also spiritual human beings, and we need to also look into that area of our life that needs to be cared for and to be developed too. And I would say under this particular category, music, it's medicine. And it's wonderful and important that we need to be able to surround ourselves with the right kind of music to be able to encourage us, help us to cope too. Now, we are emotional beings too. We can often somehow be cruel to ourselves. We are hard on ourselves. Can I often say this? Perfectionism is poison. Self-compassion is the right kind of antidote that we need. We need to be kind to ourselves. We don't need to be comparing with any other persons in life. We can look at our own pace in the way that we need to be function, and don't get entrapped with the notion of trying to be the best. And often somehow, when we don't achieve it, we get disappointed, we get ourselves traumatized, we get ourselves hurt too in a very particularly bad way. And then, of course, finally, it's also important that we need to look after our own psychological being too. Yeah, the world is very full of negativism, and so it's important to have positive thinking. And to be able to have positive thinking, it requires us to learn not just to recall good positive life events of our that we have encountered in our life, but it's also good that sometimes if we participate and get involved in showing acts of kindness, expressing gratitude to what we do, we may ourselves find that we have better coping skills and are able to function better than others too. And I often say that hugging yourself is good for your mental health, because it's good to give yourself a pat on the back every now and then. Now, this is a very simple way of actually getting yourself to be able to help out to people who may, in some ways, on the very journey of trying to seek help in a traumatized situation. However, there's also something particularly important and very unique that many people have been following, and it's called the ACT therapy. Now, ACT therapy became very well known because it's well developed by Stephen Hayes, who in one of the TED Talks revealed that he, out of his own suffering of panic disorder that he was facing in his life, that he developed this approach. And in so doing, in coping with his own struggles, it has helped him to become more functional. And in so doing, he's also able to impart this and help others who may be having chronic pain, addictions, anxiety, depressions, OCDs, and psychosis itself. And this hexagonal model is very, very useful that we can be thinking about, right? Well, first of all, when someone has been traumatized, very often we focus only on the past, the things that have gone wrong. And yet at the same time, we worry too. Yeah, because I haven't coped, this has disadvantaged me. I don't know how to face the future. Now, in this approach, it requires us to be thinking that, mindfulness helps us to stay here in the very present. We should also enjoy and savor the present, the times that we have here without judging the experience that we've just been going through, without trying to even to predict or change that experience. The second important thing that has come true, because ACT stands for acceptance, and it's important that, whatever thoughts that we may be having, it's good to know that, they are there as a historical event that has already taken place. One of the biggest struggles in anything is that, we often ignore it. But the right thing and the right approach that Stephen has been telling us is this, that we need to learn to be able to accept this, in life. I know we have some friends who are here from Scotland. I wonder whether our friends in Scotland realize that, if you are trained to be a medical doctor, you may get a book called Tools of the Trade, and it says, Poems for New Doctors. And in the Poems for New Doctors, there is this poem called The Guest House. And this is compiled together by the Scottish Poetry Library. And it's a way to kind of illustrate the concept of acceptance. And just listen to it for a while. As the guest house says, this being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing. Invite them in, the poet says. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. And I thought that's interesting, isn't it? To encourage us to learn that if something has happened, take it that it happened, and accept the experience, the thoughts, the feelings, even if they may be negative in themselves. And then the next part is cognitive diffusion. Now, while all these things are happening, it can give us a negative way of looking at life. What we could do is just to step back or step away from the problem or the issue itself. Because when you get in, all you picked up is negative self-labels. Just like you will often think that, because I have been through a bad experience, I cannot do this at all. I cannot, I can't function. This is way beyond me. Well, one of the things that cognitive diffusion does is this. It's saying that, yes, you have that thought, but that thought doesn't need to define you, doesn't need to be labeled upon you. You haven't tried it, but you can. If you take a step back and be able to separate yourself from the thought, and then you probably would have better help in being able to cope yourself. And that comes in a very way, to try to understand ourselves. Very often we think of the mind that we use as a canvas in which we can paint thoughts, okay? So I would suggest that, take our minds as the area in which it's like the sky, a beautiful sky that you have out there, whether it's not dark or it's bright itself, it really depends on you. And the thoughts and our feelings are really the weather things that you see, whether you put in more clouds, whether you have birds flying itself. It's a place, the sky is simply the place where the weather occurs. It is not the storm, but the context where the storm occurs. You see, the thing is like this. If you look at self as a content that holds all these things, it becomes very inflexible and it ties you down and it puts you on the roll and the ramp of defeatism. But if you see self as a context itself, not as a content, then there is a bit more of flexibility, that you have hope. You can reshape things. The things of the past is the past, but for the future, it's up to you to plan. It's up to you to be able to visualize what your future could be. The next area, which is also very important in traumatic work, is to provide right kind of values. Values that are good are like the directional arrows that guide you in life. So we can help our clients to be able to choose and be clear. There are so many things happening in our life. Which are the ones you want to keep? And if you keep this, how does it make you and define you for the future? The positive ones are the useful ones to have. The negative ones are the ones that you really don't want. And so it's important that you must be clear about the values. And when you hold to these values, consciously or subconsciously, it directs and governs our steps for us to kind of move on. Now, finally, in this hexagonal model, with all these things that have taken place and all the things that needs to be looked into, then it really comes to a way in which you want to work this out. There must be a need for you to respond. And the need for you to respond is, it's time for you to take action to be able to move forward. And so you work out a program in which you help your members to be able to move, to go ahead itself. I like this because it tells us that, it does get better, I promise. Just keep moving forward one day at a time. And, so when you are able to do one day at a time, you don't get so overwhelmed. You don't get so disheartened. I learned this from Brown Girl Trauma, someone who has been working very much with adult children of dysfunctional families. And Nisha Patel, who runs this blog, has been working with many people in different parts of the world to be able to take small baby steps in their own life to be able to cope, manage, and move forward. Now, as time is running out, I just want to put in something for us to be thinking about that is part of the mindfulness approach that can be very, very helpful. And it's something called leaves on a stream, and it's an acceptance and commitment therapy approach that helps us to cope with. Sometimes we get intrusive thoughts, ideas, and feelings which we really don't like, and we really don't know how to be able to deal with it. And if you can, I just want to take you for a little journey and just wonder for yourselves, when was the last time you actually take a walk and find yourself in the stream, whereby, you can see water flowing in the waterfall and you're enjoying nature itself. And I think that's a wonderful therapeutic way for all of us to be thinking, because it helps us to come back to nature and find life that will be helpful for ourselves. But very, very quickly, in this particular approach, so when you are just seated by a stream and enjoying the atmosphere itself, and if all kinds of thoughts come to your mind and you're afraid of them, one of the things you can do is that if you could imagine that you can pick up a leaf and you attach your thoughts with this leaf and let it flow, and let it flow, and see that thought flow away on the stream right until it is out of sight. Now, if you could process this and visualize this for a while, you find that in time to come, you will learn to be able to let go of thoughts that somehow plagued you and make it difficult in your life and that you find difficult to cope. Yeah. Well, the trap of trauma is this, that, if our minds are such that takes us to and park us in places that we don't want to go, we know that negativism can never give us a positive approach. But if we are able to change our thoughts and give it an opportunity, then we can be able to change our life. Melinda Longton says, trauma may happen to you, but it can never define you. And if we believe in this, then we realize that there is hope for every one of us. Finally, as we come to the end, I promise you just a couple of slides more. Michelle Rosenthal says, trauma creates change you don't choose. Healing is about creating change you do choose. And when we can see it, we indeed will find that, we will get better in our own lives itself. And one of the interesting things is there is a World Trauma Day. And just in case you want to know when is this, World Trauma Day happens on October 17th of the year. And then maybe we'll have another occasion to be able to help bring together our thoughts. With this, I'm going to hand the time back to Glenn. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Chooi Seng. Well done. Thank you so much. We've got so much content, but so little time. At this point in time, we've got our Q&A board that has been filling up, quite aggressively. Questions are pouring in fast and furious. If you have not yet, please, you can still squeeze in your last few questions up there. Why don't I share mine as can I? Yes. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions here. And even if you don't post any questions, you've got no questions, all you need to do is just read the voluminous board full of questions, and you can vote for the most agreeable question there so that it gets bumped up and we will pick those up. So we're going to start with this first. First and foremost, 3 speakers, we are being spotlighted. And we're going to ask, we're going to take this first question. I think this had the most votes. What should be the counseling community's response to the chronic complex religious trauma suffered by the LGBTQ+ community? I'm going to ask Tony to take on this first question, maybe.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. I would say the stance should be no different as to work with any other people groups. Most important thing is, as a counseling therapist or part of that community, most important is to support the LGBTQ with hope, help them to create their identity, their belief, and the key things was not to be isolate them, but instead helping them to integrate, and they are no different from any group that we work with. In my work, this is quite a common thing, and very often it can be quite challenging because they struggle with so much distress from, especially those with religious. I think the best approach, and my experience also say, is they are no different from any group, and we have to apply what we know from the technique, the main point, the main standpoint, to help them to be functional again in the society. So that's where I will come from. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's true that all trauma, whether it's religious trauma, whether it's affecting LGBT groups or any other sectors who might be victimized, should seek the same proper process and protocol of counseling and or assessment from a trained psychologist. Okay, I think we should move to the next one. I hope we have time for at least 6 questions maybe. Chooi Seng, are you ready for this one? Are we able to reduce our susceptibility to triggers? I'm curious about this question because is it triggers alone, like flashback triggers, or current incidences, traumatic incidences as well? So maybe Chooi Seng, over to you.
Well, I think Tony has done very well in telling us the window of tolerance, and it's important for every one of us to build our own resilience. We need a resilience approach in order to help us to be able to stand the onslaught of traumas. Somebody earlier on put in a question, what do you do if it's is this a phobia or is this a traumatic experience? Now, if a phobia is unattended for too long, there is a possibility that it may develop into a trauma. And so it's good to just talk to someone about it, and thereby to be able to build some resilience for yourself, and thereby not be so open and vulnerable, whereby small little things or the repeats itself cause us to be fearful and then traps us and be able to function in a very unhelpful manner.
Yeah. So really, resilience really is the answer to that. How do we build resilience? I know on one hand, we have to treat and resolve certain like wounds, but on the other hand, I think we can progress and also build emotional strength and resilience, and those two needs to, be balanced out as well. Okay. Though I have experienced similar symptoms, how do I know for sure that they are trauma-induced behaviors? Tony, you mentioned a little bit again, this is the window and also the impact of trauma. Could you just take this on very quickly? Like the difference?
Okay, so how do we know, like I did explain the difference between trauma and difficult moment, right? I believe Glenn also listed some criteria for trauma. I would say, how do we know is this trauma induced? I would say if the symptom have caused a certain level of dysfunctionality in your daily life, or they've been having constant flashback, or you can Google online DSM-5 criteria for trauma. You can do quite an in-depth understanding. And if those things are often happening in your life, I would say go and visit a psychologist or a therapist who specialize in trauma. They could properly diagnose you whether does that contribute to trauma. Yeah. I know online there are quite a few literature or information on that, but if you're really unsure, talk to someone who is specialized in that. I believe nowadays quite a lot of clinicians are trained. The work of training has been quite extensively been reaching out to all these professionals. So I don't see there's an issue with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Tony, while you're at it, you might as well just continue. Can you just continue with this one?
Okay.
Does the exhibition of the fight, flight, freeze form behavior always means the person has trauma?
I would say fight flight is quite common. It's always happening in us. It's part of the way we respond to things around us. If you do have freeze and frowns response in your day-to-day presentation, I would say you may need to explore it further with a professional, right? Because yes, we do have freeze. Like I give an example. I live in Thailand, so it's quite. I'm right in the middle of the nature, so it's quite common to have rat and things and all this. So there was one night when I was walking back to my home, and there was a rat that dashed past, and it was so fast that I got shocked. So that is basically a freeze response, but doesn't mean it's my trauma. So I would say if it doesn't happen frequently, then it may not be of concern. But it's always happening and you are always stuck in freeze or frowns symptoms, it's good to check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to also add that all these are also classified as maladaptive behaviors, right? They are maladaptive because we've grown to respond to certain, either triggers or incidences in a dysfunctional manner. Some of it could be patterns already because it's just simply a conditioning. And yeah, it's always good to check it out, even though it may not directly be trauma related. But it is an indicator that, behaviorally wise, we are not functioning at our optimum as well. Okay, a bit more scientific as well. Could trauma cause OCD or GAD? Or maybe the question could be better rephrased as are OCDs and GAD, meaning generalized anxiety disorders, related to trauma, or are they symptomatic of trauma? Chooi Seng, any thoughts on this?
I think it varies from case to case. I think it's not always a very healthy way to kind of prejudge by saying that, hey, if somebody has OCD, yeah, it must be because of traumatic experience. It could also be an imprinting that the person have in their own life, that they, have been taught that, hey, general cleanliness is important. We want to stay healthy, so we need to wash our hands. And so you want to repeat a certain way of cleanliness and expectation. There are also, of course, general anxiety disorders that which may not be related to the very fact that you have been traumatized. You just by disposition a much more meek person, and thereby your level of tolerance is different. Yeah. So I wouldn't really often want to judge unless I do a clinical test with an assessment of the person first, to be able to establish truly or not, at what scale is this clinically the person being affected, or is this just a general challenge that the person is facing? And it may also be a passing phase in the person's life, after which that the person becomes normal itself. So I would not want to prejudge the person until we do a proper clinical analysis.
That's right. And I'd like to remind everybody here, since this is a public webinar, that while on the onset, on the outset, the information provided could link it to trauma-induced behavior, the proper protocol would be to seek professional help and to have it accessed and diagnosed clinically. Otherwise, it'll just be anecdotal info gathering. Tony, get ready to answer this one, because you talk about the brain earlier on, while I address this one right now. How can we effectively support others who have had experienced trauma as well as this one? What are some ways someone can recover from trauma if they are traumatized by mental health? So it's very specific, by a mental health professional, and the act of seeking help from a professional is traumatizing. Well, that's very unfortunate, because all mental health professionals, practitioners, we are bound by a code of ethics. We are supposed to conduct ourselves professionally. We are trained. We are accountable to the association that we serve in. And so if you are traumatized by that, whether it's by intent or not, I wonder if the professional in mention is even aware of that. Sometimes we get triggered. I like to use the word symbolically. I speak a little bit about myself, because previously, when I was young, growing up, I was very rebellious, and I came from a traumatic background, upbringing, parents and all that. And so authority figures would trigger me. So in school, of course, teachers were authority figures, and then I got trouble in the law. So police, prison, wardens, officers, anybody who wears a badge or uniform, they would trigger me, and I would take it personally. Obviously, I do not know them at a personal level, but they symbolize authority figures. And, there's such a term called SAF, significant authority figures in our lives that shape us. But if these people were not there to care for us, or did not provide emotional support when we're growing up, so like for me, I suffered from a couple of ACEs as well, adverse childhood experiences, then that impact would have been really great. And so whoever that I saw, back then growing up, there was help given by the government as well, counselors, social workers. I was always giving them a lot of problems. It wasn't until I had mentor friends and the right community, peer support as well, that I could identify with and who were very supportive. I found that in my church, and they really helped me to understand and to repurpose the pain that I went through. Okay, so this is quite unfortunate, but constantly seek out help and peer support groups, support networks. I think that will be really, really helpful if a particular individual cannot get through to the person. I'm going to link it to this one very quickly. To what extent does trauma affect, this one, how can we help others effectively support? So as I mentioned, the community has a big part to play. It takes a whole village to help someone heal as well, because a lot of truths and beliefs about life and the worldview are a social construct, right? It's not just an individual, and sometimes we can't just work that out or resolve that out in a clinical setting, just one-on-one talk therapy. So sometimes we need the community as well. I would like to just very quickly, before I pass to Tony for this question, also say that healing from past wounds and traumatic experiences is very doable. You can resolve them. And the way to do that is not avoid it or not treat it like a problem alone that needs to be solved, but the word is integration. How do you embrace even the pain? And I know it's easily said than done, but the person who is able to embrace and accept, and because 𝗧𝗢 Seng was talking about acceptance as well, would be the one who would integrate that part of the pain in his life into his new self, his identity, in a way that is repurposed and redeemed. So when a person is able to do that, firstly, the feelings and the emotional attachments would dissipate, like the shame maybe, or the fear. And not only that, you come out stronger and you're able to use that. So from a utilitarian point of view, you're able to use the past pain, maybe inspire others, maybe teach it, maybe help others who are going through the same pain as you. That would be the mark, I would say, even the litmus test of true recovery. Okay, so I hope that answers. Tony, are you ready to answer this? To what extent does trauma affect the brain?
Yep. All right. This is quite an interesting question because it varies, right? So one thing we have to understand is the resiliency level of the clients. The same event, it could happen to different people and they could have different response, all right? And also it depends on the intensity and how long has this been impacting that individual. So I actually run a rehab that we work with traumatized people, and they also present with mental health disorder. So in the population that I work with are really people at with intense severity of their issue or trauma. The people that I work with, as I said, they usually come to me with very severe, the severity of their condition are quite bad. And that's why they need rehab, an inpatient setting to work with them. But I also know that there are outpatient settings that people do work with traumatized. So those are probably not at the acute phase. They are much more manageable. They're still able to function on a daily basis. So to what extent it really varies. One of the approach I use here is using neurofeedback called the brain mapping analysis to understand the extent of impact it had on the brain. And from there, we can really determine how intense the therapy should be, what type of therapy will be the best approach. So in summarize to this answer, it varies, but it does have an impact, I would say. You know, because by the time you realize that your life are dysfunctional and there's issue, it's really, there are some signs happening and symptoms. So like I say, it really depends on the resiliency level of that person. So if that person have a higher resiliency, it means their symptoms probably are not as bad as it should be. Or people with a lower resiliency element level, their element of trauma could be more severe.
Yep.
So it plays out differently.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, 𝗧𝗢 Seng. I think we've come to the end. It's already 9:30, and we did pretty well in this Q&A segment because we answered all the 5 and above voted. I think about 8 questions or more. And I'll tell you what, we're going to kind of invite those of you who still have questions and you need help and support. I'm going to pass the time right now to 𝗧𝗢 Miss 𝗧𝗢𝗡𝗚 is our co-founder of Breakthrough Therapy and Academy, as well as Architects of Life. She's the ED of that. Slides, please, guys. Yeah. And at this point in time, I'm going to pass over to 𝗧𝗢 to round things off.
Glenn, would you like to just talk about some of the activities that we have first?
Okay, I can do that. So as I was mentioning, we would like to continue the support for some of you. I know a 90-minute webinar will not suffice in supporting other than give you the information that is out there. So this is a free counseling consultation for you or maybe your loved ones. Remember, it's a consult that you can book an appointment with either on Zoom or maybe a quick call, 15-20 minutes. We'll do a quick assessment just to continue the follow-up support for those of you who really, really need that help. We don't want to close the doors once this 90 minutes is up. So you can actually scan, or the link is being pumped into the chat box right now. Next. And also we've got a couple of programs under Breakthrough Therapy and Academy. This one is developed by me over the last few years during pandemic. It's called EDT, Energy Defragmentation Therapy, because trauma, what it does essentially is fragment our splinter, our souls, our thinking. We get into conflict, or rather, what we are on the outside does not reflect our true, authentic self inside. So anyway, I've got a free video training. If you scan this or the link, you can click on it anytime. Next, for those of you who really want help in Singapore, we've got a Skills Future accredited and WSQ accredited CST, Counseling Skills Training, which is a 2-day course. I see some of our graduates in here in this room. You can scan this for more information. It's funded by the government. Yep, 70% funding, and you get a certificate of achievement. So this counseling skills training was really needed to the mass, to the public in Singapore during the pandemic, and now it's still going in its second year. Okay. Next, do we have anything else? Oh yeah, NLP. We've got an upcoming information preview webinar, just 45 minutes. Again, scan or click on the link for more information. Anyway, we're going to pass you the link tree. So under this link tree, which is a 1-pager with all the links inside, do we have that slide? That would be like a glossary of all our activities and training courses.
Do check out the programs that we have shared earlier on. Or if you are here tonight because you really want to be equipped with skills, strategies, tools, frameworks to support your loved ones, your colleagues, or your friends, you could also check out the programs that we have shared earlier on. All these are geared towards equipping the layperson to be the first responder of help to support someone who is going through a difficult time. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight.